So we're going to cover, inshallah, quite a bit of ground this evening. I will most certainly leave a lot of things out because in order to really do justice to this topic, it would probably take me at least a 15-week semester to cover everything. But inshallah, hopefully we can cover before Maghrib the main points, and then we can come back after Maghrib and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. And hopefully anything either that I have left out, we can go ahead and address, or if you would like to go into more detail about something that I am bringing up, we can then go ahead and do so. Well, I don't have to tell you, of course, the importance of Al-Aqsa when it comes to its spiritual significance within Islam. There are Quranic verses and there are hadith that, of course, mention it very specifically. Especially when we see here that it is the Masjid itself that is cited both in the Quran and in the Hadith tradition. And of course, Al-Quds being the very first Qibla until the year 624, when, of course, the Qibla then changes direction to its current day orientation toward Mecca. Of course, the city of Jerusalem has quite a bit of historical significance when it comes to Muslim history, and especially in the year 638 under the caliphate of Umar radiallahu anhu, and the conquest of Jerusalem after Damascus had already been taken, fulfilling an edict that had been established by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to expand Muslim influence beyond the Arabian Peninsula. And we find that this happens fairly early on in the second caliphate of Muslim history. You know the story, of course, that Omar is required to go to Jerusalem because the Byzantine governor refused to surrender except to the Khalif himself. And so Omar makes the trip. The city is given to Omar, and he liberates the city by allowing Jews to return to Jerusalem. They had been banned by the Byzantines, along with some Christian denominations. The Christian denominations were banned because they were seen as heretics. The Jews were banned because they were seen as and accused of having killed Christ, so committing the crime of deicide in their estimation. It is one of the reasons why, of course, then there were Jewish tribes in Arabia, and a lot of them, of course, were in Persia as well. Omar does not pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest church in all of Christendom. He prays outside it because he didn't want it to be then reconsecrated as a masjid, and this then preserves the holiest site in Christendom to this day, and the Masjid al-Umar is actually adjacent to that. But when we're talking about Al-Aqsa, and it's interesting to think about how often people, when they think about Al-Aqsa, they erroneously think of the Dome of the Rock as being the Masjid al-Aqsa. It is not. In fact, the Dome of the Rock, this most beautiful of architectural creations in Jerusalem, one that is even acknowledged as such by others, non-Muslims even, is actually where the rock from which the Prophet ﷺ ascended to the heavens. The Al-Aqsa Masjid is adjacent to that on top of this area, which I'll talk about its significance in a moment, but it is not the Dome of the Rock itself. Now here's a map which shows you, of course, the direction of Jerusalem and the direction of Mecca. And of course, what's really fascinating then is in the year 624, when the change of direction happens, it is literally 180 degrees. For any of you who have been to the Masjid al-Qiblatain in Medina, you will notice that the direction of the Qibla is exactly opposite to the direction of the old Qibla. fascinating to see how dramatic that transformation really is. As far as the site where Masjid Al-Aqsa is, we have to thank Abdul Malik I, who was the fifth of the Umayyad Caliphs, one of the Marwanid line Caliphs, not the Sufyanid line, which was from Muawiyah, Yazid, and Muawiyah II, etc. And it is he who develops a more Muslim visible presence within Jerusalem by commissioning then the construction of the Dome of the Rock. And it took a mere 3 years to go ahead and construct it. And we find, interestingly enough, that there was inspiration from the dimensions of the Christian Church of the Holy Sepulchre in order to build it. And here's a nice aerial shot of the Dome of the Rock. You see it is known as Temple Mount. It is also known as Haram al-Sharif. The Temple Mount is the name given to it by the Jewish community because this quite literally is on top of what had been the two temples of Judaism. The first temple, or the Temple of Suleiman or Solomon, was destroyed by the Babylonians in the year 586 before the Common Era. By the way, they used to call it BC. I think most people are familiar with the term BC, before Christ, but it has become more, I suppose, ecumenical to say BCE, before the Common Era. And there's no more AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. It is now known as CE, the Common Era, from essentially year 1 forward. So in about 586 BCE, we find then the destruction by the Babylonians and the expulsion of Jews, especially toward Persia. It was the second temple, which was then built, that was also destroyed, this time in the year 70 CE. So this would have been about 37 years after the ministry of Isa alayhi salam. And this time, of course, because Jerusalem was under Roman authority at the time. It is considered still, nonetheless, to be the holiest site in all of Judaism. Here's the interior of the Dome of the Rock itself. And for those of you who are also familiar with the structure, the Western Wall, as it is known, is quite literally the holiest site because it is part of what is considered to be the original dimensions of the temple. So it is that space where we will see Jews going to worship against the wall, because until, according to Jewish tradition, the third temple is rebuilt, this is as close a proximity as they can go ahead and reach. Now, Jerusalem was seen as the prize during the Crusades. Interestingly enough, the Crusades really had nothing to do with religion. It had to do more with the exploitation of religion. In 1095, Pope Urban II issues what is known as a papal bull, an edict calling for Western Europeans to travel to the Holy Land to liberate Jerusalem from the infidels. Back then, that was us, it was Muslims. The word infidel is quite contested. There's a book by Andrew Wheatcroft called Infidel, which is literally a history of the word infidel. The call for the Crusades in 1095 occurs 24 years after the Seljuks defeated the Byzantine Empire in Manzikert in Asia Minor. And this worried Western Christianity because they thought now the Byzantine Empire is no longer trusted to be able to serve as a firewall from Muslim expansion. And remember, at this time, Islam was already in Europe. It was in Spain. So there was a real concern that there could be forces from the East and forces from the West which could essentially infiltrate Western Europe. But by and large, the Crusades came along because Western Europe was in a turmoil of political conflict. And so this was a good way to then divert attention. And most of the wealthy who were leading the Crusades, like these individuals here, the knights, were going out of greed and ambition and opportunity to gain more land and gain more wealth. Everybody in the Crusades wasn't dressed like this. They couldn't afford the armor. Most of the people who went were in fact peasants. Constantinople was used as the staging ground in 1097, and then the First Crusade moves down toward Palestine in 1099. On July the 15th of 1099, the Crusaders are successful mostly because the Muslims in control of Jerusalem were caught off guard. I mean, people were coming into Jerusalem all the time as pilgrims. None of them had tried to actually take the city. When the Crusaders do so, they banish both Muslims and Jews, and they also become very suspicious of the Christians who live there, because they quite frankly couldn't understand why Christians would live in peace with Muslims under Muslim rule. Of course, most of you are familiar with Salahuddin. Salahuddin is the victor of the Second Crusade, and 1187, on July the 4th, as a matter of fact, at the Battle of Hattin, we have Salahuddin then successfully take back Jerusalem. And despite 7 other efforts by the Crusaders to try to take Jerusalem, none of them were successful. Muslim authority stayed in Jerusalem until 1920, when the British Mandate came in. So a tremendously long time. And as you, of course, also know, Salahuddin then allowed Jews to come back to Jerusalem to live and to worship. If you've seen the movie Kingdom of Heaven, there's this scene at the end where Orlando Bloom, playing Balian, asks Salahuddin, "What is Jerusalem worth?" He first says nothing, and then he turns around and he says everything. And in many ways, this kind of captivates the way that Jerusalem is seen and contested. Here is Jerusalem during the Ottoman era. The Ottomans take Palestine and Syria from Mamluk control in the 16th century, on their way to then capturing Egypt and making Egypt a province of the Ottoman Empire. Something that remained in Ottoman control until the British occupied it in 1882. But to understand the relationship of Jerusalem, and even to understand the relationship of Jerusalem and the Jewish community, you have to then understand the Ottomans as a whole and the role that they played. Bayezid II, who was the father of Selim I, caught wind of what was happening in Spain in 1492, when the Nasrid dynasty was conquered by the kingdoms of the north, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, Ferdinand and Isabella, where they defeat the last of the Nasrid kings, Abu Abdullah, also known as Boabdil, at the Alhambra in Granada. The same Ferdinand and Isabella who then commission Christopher Columbus to sail to find new sea routes to avoid the Ottoman Empire to reach the Far East. Columbus's voyages were underwritten and subsidized by confiscated Jewish and Muslim property in Spain. When Bayezid finds out about the treatment of Muslims and Jews that remained in Spain, he sends ships to Spain and rescues up to 150,000 Jews, mostly, and Muslims to gain sanctuary in the Ottoman Empire. And most of the Jews who then come and settle in the Ottoman Empire, who were Sephardic, North African and Iberian Jews ethnically, they settle in places like Salonika, which is today in Greece, and Istanbul, and in Izmir, which is on the Asian side of, the western side of the Asian side of Turkey, or what is known as Anatolia. Most Jews did not go to Palestine because Palestine was considered to be far away from really the commercial hub of the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, one thing that the Ottomans did very well was keep scrupulous notes and records. And in 1517 to 1520, they took a census of Palestine, and they found that the Jewish population there was only 5,000. By the turn of the 20th century, the Jewish population of the Ottoman Empire was somewhere around 225,000. Salonika was 35% Jewish. Istanbul was 25 to 30% Jewish. Izmir was 25% Jewish. These were considered to be the more vital cities. These are the more vibrant cities. And despite the fact that there was an opportunity, we find that the Jewish communities stayed there. And in fact, the Jewish community in Istanbul to this day is the descendants of the Jewish community that was rescued by Bayezid II from Spain. And the very first time that I went to Istanbul, I came out of my hotel room to go find a masjid to go pray Asr, and to go pray in a nice Ottoman-era masjid. And so there was one close to my hotel room, and I see a gentleman who is sort of walking very fast, and he was dressed in what looked identifiably as Jewish clothing. And so I asked him, I said, you know, what's the rush? And he says, well, I'm going to pray. And I said, can I walk with you? I've got some questions. And he said, sure. And I said, well, how long have you lived in the city? And he said, 500 years. And so I calculated that this was in 2003, so basically his family was one of those families that came there by way of Bayezid II. They also had a Jewish community settle in Sarajevo and other parts of the Balkans under the Ottomans. Selim I, as I mentioned, Bayezid II's son, then takes Jerusalem and Palestine and Syria and brings it under Ottoman authority. You see here Suleiman the Magnificent as well, who was Selim I's son. He was also somebody who encouraged Jewish migration to the Ottoman Empire and also encouraged free worship. It is under the Ottomans that they set up what is known as the millet system, where the Jewish community was allowed to choose its own authorities, its own rabbis, and any matters that were of Jewish law were handled within the community with the full authority of the Ottoman Empire behind them. So here you see a graphic of the European and the Asian sides of Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, and you see where Salonika is. It was known as the Salonika Vilayet. Now, fast forward into the 19th century, and what we find then is a tale of multiple Jewish communities. The community that was in the Ottoman Empire was a Jewish community that was not European as we understand it. It was Sephardic, meaning from North Africa and from Spain, Portugal. It was Mizrahi, which was the Syrian, Iraqi, Palestinian Jewish community that was already there. There was a Tamimi Jewish community, which was from Yemen. There's, of course, also the Falasha Jewish community, which is from Ethiopia. But generally speaking, when we understand the move toward Jewish nationalism, this is a movement that comes from outside the Muslim world. It, in fact, comes from Europe. And it comes from the ethnic demographic known as the Ashkenazi Jewish community. And the Ashkenazim, both in Western and in Eastern Europe, were facing quite a lot of persecution. In Eastern Europe, in places like Russia, there was just flat-out persecution, and particularly at times when there were famines, when there was poor crop yield. Many of them were living in rural areas, and given the mismanagement by the Tsar and the royal family of Russia, in complicity with the Russian Orthodox Church, the Jews became a very convenient scapegoat. And in 1882, there was a massive pogrom or campaign against Jews in Russia. Now, in Western Europe, the Jewish community had a different trajectory. For them, they were not rural, but they were mostly based in cities. They were mostly in urban areas. And in Western Europe, now that it had gone through with Enlightenment philosophy and all, and had secularized, Jews were essentially given an option. If you want to integrate into society, you leave your Jewishness at the door before you leave the house. If you want to preserve your Jewish identity, well, then you pretty much self-segregate. And it's for this reason why you see really two different Jewish communities rise in Europe and Western Europe at this time. One which is more visibly Orthodox, and the other which secularizes to the point where many Jews also then convert out of Judaism and either convert into some form of Christianity or become atheist. So some of the most famous European Jewish names at this time, like Karl Marx, may have been ethnically Jewish, but his family had converted to Christianity one generation early. The British Prime Minister under Queen Victoria, Benjamin Disraeli, was actually Portuguese Sephardic, but his family had converted to the Church of England. So this was a very common practice to try to find space within secular Europe. And it worked in some ways, but there was still a lot of anti-Semitism. There was a case in France in 1894 where a French captain by the name of Alfred Dreyfus was wrongly accused of treason, and essentially he was tried and convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment solely because he was Jewish. There really was no evidence. He was later vindicated, but this sent a shockwave throughout the Jewish community, particularly in Western Europe, to say, well, what else can we do in order to escape this kind of discrimination? Is there any place that is really safe for us? And modern Zionism then develops at this time. There was always a sense of, and I'll use the word sort of in its most generic sense, looking at Jerusalem as a Qibla for Judaism. After all, this is where the temple is, this is where there was a historical connection. But European nationalism, as it develops in the 19th century, then starts to influence Western European Jews who were, by and large, not very theologically self-identifying as Jews. They were predominantly now secularized, and for them, the notion of European ideas of modern nationalism are married to this sense of nationalism for Jewish communities, for some kind of safety and security. European nationalism was almost entirely based on common language, common ethnicity, common race, common religious community. So this idea of grouping then forms a way of understanding the kind of Zionism which is now developing in Europe. In many ways, if you think about it then, Zionism, as it then is expressed through modern Zionism, and even what is called Arab nationalism, were inorganic in Jewish and Muslim narratives because Jews and Muslims had, by and large, had different historical experiences. So when you find then that when people talk about the Arab nationalism that develops in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century and Jewish forms of nationalism, these weren't part of the natural history of each of these religions. Nationalism in Europe is very much a product of religious wars between Catholics and Protestants in the 17th century, something that you didn't find in Jewish and Muslim histories. So here we have Nathan Birnbaum, who develops in 1890 one definition of Zionism, the national movement for the return of the Jewish people to their homeland and the resumption of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. It wasn't the only definition of Zionism, but it was one that certainly then gained quite a bit of traction. 3 years after the Dreyfus case in France, there was the convening of the World Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. And it is here where Theodor Herzl, who is considered to be essentially the father or the founder of modern Zionism, then comes up with the idea that yes, now is the time, because we have evidence that we will never be accepted in even Western Europe, despite the fact that they had said that the price of admission is secularism. That's still not enough. And the Basel program then was aimed to establish for the Jewish people a publicly and legally assured home in Palestine. And I think that it's important to see how the language here changes, because a homeland may not necessarily mean full sovereignty, but more from the standpoint of having a shelter or an oasis. And this is based on Herzl's very famous book called Der Judenstaat, or the Jewish State, where he is borrowing from the old glory of Jewish history, bringing in, of course, some religion there in order to then justify the connection to the land, and also hopefully try to invigorate non-secular Jews into this project, but then also, again, working with his core community of Western European Jews to then say, this is our time, this is an opportunity that we should then consider this to be our home. It was not the only idea for where a Jewish homeland should be. In fact, here you see that there were others that were being considered. One was in what is today Uganda. Another was to have an area within the Soviet Union. Madagascar, the island nation off Africa, and British Guyana as well in South America. So all of these were being considered. Why were they not then recognized, or why were they not put forward even further? Well, there were a few reasons. One was that in the case of British East Africa and British Guyana, the British were not willing to give up part of their empire to allow for an establishment of a Jewish homeland. And similarly, we find that to be the case with Madagascar. And of course, when it came to the Soviet Union, this was really not a very attractive offer, given how deeply rooted anti-Semitism was in Russia. In fact, that's one of the issues in Russia today, is the re-emergence of anti-Semitism there. The British and the French were really, really good with promising people land that didn't belong to them, which of course then becomes one of the root problems. So getting back to then understanding Jerusalem and where it ties into the idea of Zionism, it's helpful to then understand Zionism as having 4 different dimensions. So when we hear people talk about Zionism, or even saying, well, I am a Zionist, and of course this then becomes, in today's debates, a kind of a litmus test that people are saying, are you a Zionist? Are you not a Zionist? Are you an anti-Zionist? It becomes complicated. And I know even nowadays using the word complicated in this debate is complicated. But you have a political form of Zionism, which is what Herzl was talking about here. We have a practical form of Zionism, which is migration to Palestine to settle a homeland. But chartering for the land was not a priority. Again, this is looking at it as a safe haven. Europe is no longer safe. It is proven to be hostile. Better to move there, and we have some kind of connection to the land. There is the revisionist notion of Zionism, which is very, very romanticized. It is the idea of having a Jewish national identity, the idea of having agency over that identity, understanding that there is a historical connection to it, and then what becomes contentious, particularly for some, this phrase, a land without a people, for a people without a land. The idea of creating these kinds of cutesy binaries that oppose each other, of course, then becomes very controversial because it has the potential to erase people there. Obviously, it is not a land without a people, but if you're sitting in Western Europe and you've never visited there, and it is something that is just in your imagination, it's not difficult to see how people would fall for that. And then, of course, lastly, there is the religious connection, theologically speaking, that God gave the covenant to Abraham for the land when Moses delivers the children of Israel in the book of Exodus in the Bible it is to the land west of the Jordan. So each of these can be a form of Zionism, and depending on whom you ask, you're going to get one or more of these as the motives for why people consider them to be Zionist. Now, what's interesting is that two of the most prominent Zionists, one who then became the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, and the other who became sort of the ideological father for particularly the Jewish right in Israel, the Likud party, including Benjamin Netanyahu, a man by the name of Vladimir Jabotinsky. Both of them came from Eastern Europe, so both of them were facing some of the most brutal forms of anti-Semitism. They show up in the Ottoman Empire and they go to Salonika, which has this very large Jewish community there. And they try to make the pitch for them to sign on to their project of Zionism. And they go to the person who they think will be the most receptive to hear the argument and who might be the most influential to bring people on board. And it was a man by the name of Avraham bin Shaprut. Avraham bin Aroya. Avraham bin Shaprut was the customs officer in Cordoba under Muslim Spain. But Avraham bin Aroya is the head of the largest labor union in Salonika. And he was a Bulgarian Jew. So Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky say, hey, we should have your support. Let's go ahead and establish a homeland in Palestine. And bin Aroya rejects them. He says, you got to be out of your mind. I'm not signing on to this project. It, in fact, offends us. We are fine here. We are completely part of Ottoman society in Salonika. Why would we possibly want to go there? And on top of that, he regarded Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion as being too elite. Here was a guy in a labor union or a trade union. He says, you know, I'm kind of more working class, thank you very much. And mind you, from 1882 until the beginning of World War I in 1914, Ottoman sultans permitted migration to Palestine. From 1882 until about 1904, there were 35,000 Jews who were let into Palestine as refugees from Russia and from the Ukraine. And then in the 10 years preceding World War I, from 1904 to 1914, another 40,000 were let in by the sultans and by the Committee for Union and Progress, who were in charge of the Ottoman Empire. So the idea then that there was something necessarily preventing Jewish migration to Palestine, even under the Ottoman Empire, is a complete fallacy. There is, of course, the very famous story that Abdul Hamid II, who was the Sultan Khalif from 1876 until 1909, was offered by the Jewish National Fund a tremendous amount of money, something on the lines of, I think, $150 million, or pounds sterling, which back then would have been in the billions, if he would then grant the land to the Jewish National Fund. And he said, it's not my land to grant, so I cannot go ahead and do that. That money would have clearly helped the Ottoman Empire with its massive financial challenges, but he declined to accept that money. Well, Jewish migration then is suspended because World War I begins in 1914, and we find then that there is an opportunity that is lending itself because now nationalism has arrived among the Arab communities of the Ottoman Empire. And particularly here we have Sharif Hussein, who was the governor of the Hejaz, including, of course, Makkah and Medina, who saw an opportunity to go ahead then and have a kingdom of his own. And he is approached by the British, including, of course, T.E. Lawrence, who served as the liaison, as in Lawrence of Arabia, to act on behalf of the highest-ranking British authority in Egypt, Sir Henry MacMahon. The British had occupied Egypt since 1882 because of the Suez Canal. They had bought it in 1875 from the Egyptians, who could no longer afford to hold onto it, despite the fact that 6 years before it had been built by the French. The French weren't very happy about that. But because they were worried that the Egyptians would default on their loans, and also that they would try to take the canal back, the British then occupied it, because the Suez Canal literally then connected the entire British Empire. At the same time, the British also were developing oil interests in, well, basically Iraq, Mesopotamia, with a series of oil concessions. So if you want to understand why the Middle East is as the Middle East is today, think about three rivers: the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Nile. Everything in between that was then contested by the British. The vital strategic interests were the Suez Canal to the west and oil near the Tigris and Euphrates. Most of it was up in the north in Mosul, and then also in the south in Basra, and well, Baghdad just happened to be in the middle. These were the strategic interests which essentially drove both the British and the French in the Middle East. And most of the conflict that occurred is because of the rivalries and the mistrust between London and Paris. They simply didn't trust one another. For the French, they had, for the last 60 years, been investing in the Levant, in Syria and Lebanon. They had been championing the Christian communities, especially the Maronites there, to essentially drive a wedge between them and the Muslim communities to frustrate the Ottomans. And the British were, of course, in Egypt and Iraq. And if you take a look at the lines that are drawn, which then become the borders of the countries, this is in order for the British and the French to keep their interests away from one another. Now, the British were stretched pretty thin around the world with their much vaster empire than that of the French. They have also, as part of their governing style, the idea that if we can get locals subcontracted to do the work for us, that then makes it better for us. And so they were able to find somebody like Sharif Hussein, who already had a beef with the Ottomans and was willing to then go ahead and aid the British in order to expel the Ottomans from that land between the Tigris and the Euphrates and the Nile, which was all Ottoman Empire. And so over a period of about 9 months, from July until March of 1916, a series of letters went back and forth between Egypt and the Hijaz, between Sir Henry MacMahon and Sharif Hussein. The conduit was Hussein's son Faisal, who had been educated in Cairo and did in fact speak English. And by the end of these letters, there was an agreement that Sharif Hussein would be able to lead the Arabs, with the help of the British providing weaponry, to kick the Ottomans out of this territory, under the pretext that the territory would then become an Arab kingdom ruled by Sharif Hussein and his family. The exact contours and borders of that were kind of deferred, as long as there was an agreement in principle between these two. And that's all the British wanted, and that's all Sharif Hussein wanted. Why did he claim that he had the ability to bring forth and connect all of these Arab tribes? Well, he was from the Banu Hashim, and he said that this is going to give me the necessary credibility to galvanize the Arab peoples, whatever were the tribes, whether it was the Hawitat or others. Well, this was no small matter, because after all, not only were they kicking out the Ottomans, they were actively waging war against the Caliphate itself, because the seat of the Caliphate was in Istanbul. The Ottoman Sultan was also the Caliph. So, of course, from an Ottoman perspective, this would have been seen not only as an act of treason, but this would have been seen as an act which violated Islam. Nonetheless, Sharif Hussein and all were able to get the Arab tribes together, and over the next 2 years, they were successful in kicking the Ottomans out of this area. Now, while this agreement is going on, there is another agreement which is being negotiated by a British civil servant and a French civil servant, Sir Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges Picot. And this forms what then becomes known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which essentially draws the map of the Middle East as we understand it. It was a secret agreement which then splits the territory up. In red is the British control, and in the blue is the French control. The British control was going to extend from the Sinai all the way across today what would have been southern Israel and Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, and then making its way down the eastern side of the Arabian Peninsula. The Levant, meaning Syria, Lebanon, Mosul at the time, which then was given to the British, and then part of Anatolia in Turkey would be under French control. According to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, though, the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean was going to be an international zone. It was not going to belong to anyone. It would have been administered by the British, the French, and whomever else. So Jerusalem was not going to be part of the calculus for Sharif Hussein with this kingdom. Now, as you can see, this land that the British and the French were looking to control happened to be the same land that the Arabs thought would be under their authority, which meant that for the British to support Sharif Hussein to the establishment of an Arab kingdom didn't necessarily mean an independent, sovereign Arab kingdom. They would support it in the same way that they were supporting Egypt. But the letter that, of course, everybody thinks about and knows is 67 words from the British Foreign Minister, Lord Arthur Balfour, to a prominent member of the British Zionist movement, Lord Walter Rothschild of the Rothschild financial house. And it says essentially, His Majesty's government view in favor the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, it being understood that none of this support will prejudice the rights of non-Jews living in Palestine or the rights of Jews living anywhere else. And this language is actually rather important because it shows that the British weren't interested in supporting the establishment of an independent sovereign Jewish nation. It also shows that the British had language in there that it shouldn't upset non-Jewish, meaning Muslim and Christian communities in Palestine. And the Jews were worried that this would serve as a pretext for European countries to say that now that we've supported the establishment of your homeland there, you can leave our land here, which again was something that they had a history of experiencing. When World War I ends in November of 1918, there is then the movement toward a peace conference in Paris, France, at the Palace of Versailles. Two people are there. One representing the Arab community is Prince Faisal, Sharif Hussein's son. The other is another very prominent member of the British Zionist movement, Chaim Weizmann, who was a professor of chemistry in Manchester, who had developed a military grade use for acetone to clean the cannons and the munitions much more efficiently to allow them to get back into service more quickly. He was very well connected to people like Lord Balfour and others within the British establishment. What's interesting is that neither Weizmann or Faisal really trusted the British after World War I. everybody by now knew about the deal that was made with the Jewish community, the deal that was made with the Arab community, and Weizmann and Faisal actually issued an agreement where there would be independent of British and French oversight, an Arab state which would allow for immigration to come in and of course for Jews to be considered to be citizens. That never really came to fruition because of the establishment of the British Mandate of Palestine by the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations was actually proposed by not the British, not the French, but an American president, Woodrow Wilson, who, by the way, was hated by the British and hated by the French and basically by any other Europeans because he wanted to break up the colonial strongholds that the Europeans had. Well, for the benefit and good fortune of the Europeans, America never became a signatory to the Treaty of Versailles, and so it never became a member state of the League of Nations. And as a result of that, this sort of pre-United Nations body in Geneva was controlled by the British and the French. And so they then carve up the map of the Middle East essentially how they had envisioned it with the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Syria and Lebanon under French control, in this case Palestine, Jordan, what was known as Transjordan, as well as Iraq under British control. The idea was that the French and the British would then help these territories develop the skills, the experience, and the expertise to become independent, except they got to decide when that was. So you can imagine that there was quite a bit of manipulation going on. Now, under the British Mandate, in 1922, the British essentially split up the mandate. That area that was east of the Jordan River then becomes Jordan, and they install one of Sharif Hussein's sons, Abdullah, to be the king. They install Faisal as king of Iraq, because that idea of one big happy Arab kingdom for Sharif Hussein's family, that didn't happen. They then take control of the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. They install their own mandate commissioner, a man by the name of Herbert Samuel, who happened to be Jewish and was an ardent Zionist. The Arab community of Palestine then is up in arms because they think that, of course, Samuel is not going to be capable of being an honest broker. There are conflicts which emerge, not based on religion, but essentially based on either unemployment and economic hardships or over territory and land. One was the Nabi Musa riots of 1920. Another one happened in 1929, and yet another one happened in 1936. And every time the British way of dealing with this was to call for some kind of commission to assign blame. The one thing that remained constant is that the British then determined that neither side is ready to be independent, and so it simply then validated their reason to stay in Palestine. Over this time, migration or Jewish migration continues unabated, and particularly we find starting in 1933, Jewish migration from Europe increases dramatically with the rise of the National Socialist Party or the Nazi Party in Germany. As fascism is starting to rise in Europe, we find that Jewish migration is starting to increase as well, along with what was seen as the rise of Stalin in the Soviet Union and anti-Semitism pressure that was occurring there. Nonetheless, by 1947, there was a promise that with the war ending, that the British and the French would now start to decolonize. And in many ways, the kind of aspiration for Palestine to move toward independence was seen as a possibility because of what happened in the Indian subcontinent in August of 1947. When the British quit India, Then there was the idea, well, if they're going to quit the jewel of the crown, maybe they'll go ahead and start to pull out of other areas as well. But the problem was that by now the tensions between the Jewish and the Arab communities in Palestine were such that the prospects of living under one sovereign state were really an impossibility. The Jews wanted, of course, their own sovereign state, a culmination and a fulfillment of Zionist aspirations. And the Arabs of Palestine were saying, this is our land, it has been usurped, we should have sovereignty, because at that time they still were by far the majority landowners, and they were by far the majority population. In 1947, the British said, well, we can't handle this anymore, and they kicked it to a new international body which had been formed after the war, the United Nations. And the United Nations partition plan was, as you see in the middle graphic here, one that was not going to satisfy anybody. It was going to have in the orange areas the Jewish state, in the yellow areas the Arab state, and neither of these states was going to be contiguous. They were going to be separated by even just that very thin ribbon of land. Now you'll notice that white area with the black dot in that, that was Jerusalem. And the UN partition plan, even back then, said Jerusalem is not going to be part of a sovereign Jewish state or a sovereign Arab state. It is simply too contentious. We are going to go ahead and have it be an international zone. And as you can possibly imagine, this satisfied neither the Arabs or the Jews of the region, and essentially civil war breaks out. At this time, you then have a lot of different Arab forces move into the region to try to push back on the declaration of independence by the Jewish population, with Israel coming online in 1948. It is oftentimes wrongly stated that Israel was attacked by all of these Arab states. The only problem was there was no coordination. And most of the armies were in control of the European powers. Egypt was at this time still under British control, as was Jordan's army. Jordan's army was controlled by a man by the name of Major John Glubb, or known as Glubb Pasha. And the British had, of course, instructed him not to go ahead and lead an army into Palestine. Syria and Lebanon were under disarray thanks to the French authorities there. Nonetheless, thanks to what has been now documented even by Israeli historians like Ilan Pappé and Avi Shleim, that this was a time of ethnic cleansing and forced expulsion of Arab populations from this area. Some fled to Jordan, some fled to what is now known as the West Bank, which was under Jordanian authority as well. Of course, everything then changes in 1967 when we find the total absorption of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean under Israeli authority, including the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the area known as Sheba Farms, also the Golan Heights in southwestern Syria. And that has, of course, been the way it has been since. The Sinai Peninsula was also taken in the '67 war, but that was then given back to Egypt by way of the Camp David Accords. And so here we see a graphic of Israeli troops at the Dome of the Rock in 1967. It was captured in 6 days. Excuse me, even the narrative of this war has gone through many different iterations. Initially, it was said that it was the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and the Syrians who attacked Israel, that they were the offensive force. Then, as Israeli archival material started to be declassified, it was shown that it was not Arab aggression. In fact, it was then changed to say, well, Israel conducted a preemptive attack because of fear that Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt was launching an attack. The problem was that over 40% of the Egyptian army was bogged down in the Yemeni civil war at the time. Nasser had no interest in launching a war against Israel. The only thing he had done was ordered a blockade at the Gulf of Tiran, which was Israel's only port into access into the Red Sea because of a water rights dispute. So it's interesting to see how the narrative of the Six-Day War went from Arabs being the aggressors to then Israel launching a preemptive strike to now most conventional wisdom saying that Israel essentially were the aggressors in that war. Fast forward to the Camp David Accords under President Jimmy Carter. There were two things on the agenda. One was Egypt was looking at developing diplomatic relations with Israel for the simple reason that the Egyptian economy was in shambles. A large percentage of the Egyptian budget was going into defense. Egypt was a pariah when it came to foreign investment. Nobody considered Egypt to be a good risk because of the state of war. And so Sadat flies to Israel and addresses the Knesset, and it begins bilateral talks between Egypt and Israel. Under the prospect of a new prime minister, a new political party, Likud, because Israel until 1977 had been governed by one political party, Labor. So Sadat thought, let's try something new. They finally meet in Camp David to finalize things. Sadat tried to sue for Palestinian recognition and a return according to UN Resolution 242 of land that Israel had occupied since the 1967 war, but Begin said, no dice, not going to do it. And Begin, quite frankly, was not in much of a position to do so because his base of support came from Israeli settlers who, after 1967, Israel had settled, so to speak, in the West Bank and in Gaza. Begin was not about to lose an election that he had just barely won in the first place in '77. So Palestine then, unfortunately, was off the table. Egypt paid dearly for this. It was kicked out of the Arab League and it became a pariah to the rest of the Arab countries. Egyptians were in some cases banned from Gulf countries to be able to work there, which was a key source of foreign exchange and remittance. Moving forward, of course, there have been several different efforts to try to move toward a settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush tried with the Madrid talks. This didn't go very well at all. There was the Oslo talks and the Oslo Accord, Oslo, Norway, in 1993, which showed some promise because of the fact that there was the recognition by Yasser Arafat of Israel, and diplomatic relations were established. A capital was set at Ramallah, an airport was opened near Gaza, and there was a greater sense of hope that at the time Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin will move toward then some of the later issues that still hadn't been resolved. Right of return of Palestinians to territory and property that they had had to abandon, and then also status over Jerusalem. 1995, Rabin was assassinated by an extremist settler, a man by the name of Yigal Amir, and from that point on, we have the domination of Israeli domestic politics by the center-right, including Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu, of course, got his wish with the election of President Donald Trump. Trump simply formalized something which was informally understood anyways, the relocation of the US Embassy, but it was relocated to West Jerusalem, not to East Jerusalem. West Jerusalem had been part of Israel even before 1967, and here you see first daughter Ivanka Trump at the US Embassy rededication, whereas the embassy had until that time, along with so many other embassies in Tel Aviv, out of recognition that Jerusalem is still a contested area. Now, we've got about 10 minutes or so, inshallah, before the azan. So I want to take you to what's been going on in the last 2 to 3 weeks around Jerusalem and around Al-Aqsa. And it is a series of issues that all are interconnected. So please bear with me. The first one in this wave of conflict, if you will, was the release of the report by Human Rights Watch, a very well-respected NGO, which said really something which has been said sort of casually or informally for quite a long time. They used the A word, declaring that in fact Israel was an apartheid state, that it in fact was committing crimes of apartheid in violation of international law. The Israeli government, unsurprisingly, accused Human Rights Watch of anti-Semitism, despite the fact that the director of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, is Jewish. Go figure. But it's interesting to see that how this formalization of language was seen as so dangerous for Israel because it normalized and legitimized how world opinion has viewed this issue. And of course, apartheid is a very contentious term. It's something that people readily recognize because it was official policy in South Africa until 1994 with the election of Nelson Mandela as president of that country. So it's important to think, well, on the one hand, what would a report have to do with the kind of response that Israel had in Gaza and elsewhere? I'll get to that, inshallah. The second issue is Sheikh Jarrah, which is, anyone know who Sheikh Jarrah was, by the way? Anyone? He was Salahuddin's physician. Yeah. Salahuddin's other physician actually was also Maimonides, Musa bin Maimun, the Jewish physician, philosopher, and theologian who had to leave Cordoba in the 12th century when the Almohads came in and really made a mess of things. Well, Sheikh Jarrah is also a district in East Jerusalem. It's north of the Al-Aqsa complex. It is a very affluent district. A lot of American facilities are there. And in 1948, when the catastrophe occurred, as the Palestinians call it, the Nakba, when the Nakba occurred, you have, as I mentioned, the forced expulsion and ethnic cleansing of various villages and areas, and a group of families then settled in Sheikh Jarrah, which was under Jordanian control. This area in 1967 then came under Israeli occupation, and that land and that property has been in contention ever since. Settlers have been making legal claims to say, well, this is our territory based on Israeli law. Now, why does this matter at this particular moment? Well, the Israeli Supreme Court was going to come up with its determination and decision May 8th to May 10th. So this was now coming to a head, coming to a climax. And while this was happening, and before the Supreme Court had even made its decision, extremist settlers were going into these properties and forcibly, basically kicking out these Palestinian families, while either Israeli security forces were purported to be standing around watching or facilitating, as the allegation goes. Demonstrations begin with this, and there was, of course, quite a bit of protestation in the Sheikh Jarrah area, quite a bit of turmoil going on there. That was one incident that was happening in May, and as of course you can imagine, this is right in the sweet spot of Ramadan occurring. But there was another issue going on just, I don't even know if you can call it kilometers, it was probably meters away, at the Damascus Gate, which is one of the prominent gates into the old city of Jerusalem. And it is an area where people will mill around, especially after Taraweeh prayer, at the Masjid Al-Aqsa, where you can access it through the Damascus Gate, especially a lot of young people, a lot of young Palestinians. The Israeli authorities then came in and erected barricades to prevent young people from milling around. This was seen as heavy-handed because they were simply socializing during Ramadan, something that's fairly commonplace to happen. The excuses that were being offered didn't really seem to match the kind of stridency and the measures that were being taken. One excuse was given, well, it's COVID, but of course, this was no different when it came to social distancing than elsewhere, and the only difference was that these were young Palestinians as opposed to others who were milling around quite freely. This then leads to quite a backlash among the young Palestinians who feel as though their spaces where they can socialize are being even further suffocated, especially at a time of Ramadan, and it is met with arrests and tear gas and more barricades. It is reopened after 2 weeks of closure, but this is happening right in the midst of Ramadan, around April 13th onwards. And as you know, Ramadan had already begun by then. And then, of course, images of which you are quite familiar, the storming of the Al-Aqsa Masjid. The Israeli authorities gave the excuse that it was Hamas that was instigating the reactions and the protests and the violence mobilization against Israel from the masjid, of which there was no evidence because this was occurring during the last 10 days of Ramadan. It was occurring while people were sitting for itikaf, something which was well known and until recently was well acknowledged and respected by Israeli authorities. So the imagery, of course, to which you have now become quite familiar, of the storming of the masjid, of the desecration of the space, of the tear gas and the stun grenades being used, not just outside, but also inside the facility as well, was one of the reasons that Hamas gave specifically for the launching of its missiles onto Tel Aviv. Sorry about the graphics, I didn't update that on the left. But the picture is the so-called Iron Dome of Israeli defense systems, an American system that has been installed there to fight off, I think somewhere along the lines of 2,000 to 2,500 Hamas rockets. And then, of course, you find the backlash by the Israeli forces on Gaza over a 10 to 11 day period. What is known, it's still not, I think it's still probably an underestimation, over 250 killed, over 3,000 homeless, over 150 buildings destroyed, including hospitals, including media offices, including that of Associated Press and Al Jazeera, as well as other NGO facilities. The one facility run by Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, was bombed. The only COVID relief center was also bombed. And the excuse, of course, was given that these are all Hamas sites. Well, I mean, the landlord might be somebody, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're offices and that there is complicity occurring there. The recent excuse that was given is that the buildings didn't actually collapse because of Israeli munitions. The buildings were already structurally weakened because Hamas built the tunnels underneath them, and so they just happened to come down. This was by Mark Regev, who is an Israeli government spokesperson, who said this, I think, 3 days ago on the BBC. Probably didn't do a good job in trying to persuade the world, because even the BBC reporter rolled her eyes when she heard that. But part of this was seen as a way to actually take Gaza further off the electric grid, to then dismantle their Wi-Fi access, to prevent social media from being able to report in real time what the carnage was and the destruction that was happening in Gaza. Now, all of those things are happening, And then there's also this. In Vienna recently, there were talks held by the Biden administration and by the Islamic Republic of Iran to try to resurrect or renegotiate the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran nuclear deal. And you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with Gaza? What does this have to do with Al-Aqsa? I know you've been really patient waiting for the punchline, so it has to do with this. The Israeli elections, there have been 4 over the last 2 years. The country is arguably as politically divided down the middle as is the United States. And Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party could not win an outright majority. And according to Israeli law, that means that the president of Israel will go to one side and give them the mandate to form a government, meaning form it in a coalition with smaller political parties. Netanyahu, 3 weeks ago, was unable to form a government, so the president then handed it off to the next largest vote recipient. And here was what was really interesting. There was a coalition government that was going to be formed, including people further to the right of Netanyahu, and for the first time an Israeli Arab political coalition known as the Joint List. The speculation is that Netanyahu was fighting for his political survival, not only because he's power hungry, but also because he is currently facing corruption charges in an ongoing trial. And if he was out of power, he would lose a lot more of the immunity mechanisms that he would have. It is incredibly cynical, but it is of course also highly likely that a lot of these flare-ups, a lot of these provocations, whether it was Sheikh Jarrah, whether it was the storming of Al-Aqsa, had to do with Netanyahu suspending or stalling or actually completely destroying the negotiations of his political opponents, because now it seems as though Netanyahu is going to be able to cut a deal with other smaller political parties and stay in power. If you're wondering whether or not this is just because of that, it seems as though that is where all the roads are pointing today. And what do we have to show for it? Of course, the carnage and the destruction, again, of Gaza. So if you're trying to then understand where Al-Quds fits into all of this, clearly Hamas was responding very specifically and directly to the desecration of the Masjid Al-Aqsa, and also the impotence of the Palestinian Authority. Mahmoud Abbas is 88 years old, hasn't had new elections in 15 years, because quite frankly, they're frightened that Hamas might even win in the West Bank and not just Gaza. It's also speculated that the Israeli government is telling the PA not to hold elections because they know that Hamas might then win. So that leaves us then essentially where we started. A very nice aerial picture of arguably the most contested piece of real estate in the world today. Whether or not this is a theological narrative, whether or not this is a historical narrative, whether it has a political dimension or some kind of other cultural dimension, the answer is yes to any of them and yes to all of them. And you see this alarming and yet not surprising symmetry that the same 4 issues, political, historical, theological, and cultural, that bring about what we understand to be Zionism today, is also matched by then the narrative of Palestinians and Muslims as to why this area is so valuable, vital, and central. Jazakallah khair.